The photograph arrived at the Vermont Historical Society in a cardboard box marked Bennington Female Seminary Archives. I was cataloging donations that summer of 2023, working as a graduate assistant while completing my thesis on women's education in 19th century New England. Most of the materials were predictable: ledgers, report cards, commencement programs, letters from alumni. But this photograph stopped me cold. It showed approximately 40 young women arranged in 4 rows in front of a brick building with tall windows. They wore the high-necked dresses and tight-waisted silhouettes typical of the 1880s. In the center of the group, seated in the second row, was an older man with a white beard, wearing a dark suit. He was the only male figure in the composition. The photograph itself was unremarkable, a standard class portrait from a women's seminary. What troubled me was the notation on the back, written in faded ink: Professor Whitmore's Natural Philosophy Class, Spring 1887. May God have mercy on their souls. May God have mercy on their souls. I'd been working with historical documents long enough to recognize when something was off. That wasn't the kind of inscription you typically found on a class photograph. It suggested something terrible had happened to these women. A tragedy, perhaps. An epidemic that had swept through the school. I began researching Professor Whitmore and Bennington Female Seminary. The school had operated from 1865 to 1905, providing higher education for young women in southern Vermont. It had been a respected institution in its time, known for its rigorous academic standards and its emphasis on scientific education, unusual for a women's school in that era. Professor Thaddeus Whitmore had taught natural philosophy, what we would now call physics, from 1882 to 1889. The seminary's records described him as a gentleman of considerable learning and intellectual curiosity, dedicated to expanding the minds of his students beyond the conventional limitations placed upon female education. I found a faculty photograph from 1885 showing Professor Whitmore with his colleagues. He looked to be in his 50s, with keen eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and that impressive white beard. There was intensity to his expression, a suggestion of fierce intelligence. But I could find no record of any tragedy befalling his students. No mention of an epidemic, no fire, no accident. The seminary's records from 1887 showed normal operations, graduations, admissions, the usual administrative business. So why that inscription? Why did someone feel the need to ask for God's mercy on the souls of these particular students? I decided to track down what had happened to the women in the photograph. It was painstaking work, cross-referencing the seminary's enrollment records with census data, marriage records, obituaries, and city directories. It took me 3 weeks, but eventually I had a list of 38 names, all the students I could identify from the spring 1887 natural philosophy class. And that's when I discovered something that made my hands shake as I typed. Every single one of them had died by 1895. All 38 students from Professor Whitmore's class had died within 8 years of the photograph being taken. At first, I assumed this had to be a mistake. I rechecked my research, verified the identities, confirmed the death records. But there was no mistake. 38 young women, all in their late teens or early 20s in 1887, all dead by 1895. Some had died in their early 20s. Others had made it to their early 30s. But none had survived past age 35, and none had died of old age. I compiled the causes of death, 15 died of what was variously described as brain fever, nervous exhaustion, or mental collapse. 12 died of wasting disease or unexplained illness. 6 committed suicide. 3 died in accidents, falls, drowning, fire. 2 were murdered by their husbands. 1 died in childbirth, though her death was described as unusual by her physician. 38 women, dead within 8 years. That was statistically impossible. Young, educated, middle-class white women in the late 19th century had relatively low mortality rates. They should have lived into their 50s, 60s, even 70s. But every single student from Professor Whitmore's 1887 natural philosophy class had died young, and most had died of conditions affecting the mind or nervous system. I found more disturbing details as I dug deeper. Several of the women had been institutionalized before their deaths, committed to asylums for hysteria or delusional behavior. I found medical records and asylum admission papers that painted a troubling picture. Mary Elizabeth Hartwell, age 23 at death, 1892. Patient exhibits profound anxiety and reports persistent visions of impossible geometries, claims to see spaces that should not exist, becomes violent when prevented from attempting to draw these visions. Cause of death, self-inflicted wounds. Sarah Jane Mitchell, age 26 at death, 1893. Patient suffers from acute insomnia and reports that sleep brings nightmares of such intensity that she fears losing her sanity. Has not slept more than 2 hours consecutively in 6 months. Cause of death, heart failure brought on by exhaustion. Carolyn Winters, age 24 at death, 1891. Patient insists that the natural laws governing reality are wrong, and that she can perceive the true structure beneath the apparent world. Repeatedly warns staff that he showed us too much. Cause of death, undetermined. Found deceased in locked cell with no marks of violence. He showed us too much. I felt cold as I read that phrase. Caroline Winters had said that 2 years before her death. Who was he, and what had he shown them? I found more references in other records. A letter from Margaret Sullivan to her sister, 1890. I cannot forget what we learned in Professor Whitmore's class. The knowledge haunts me. I wish I had never attended that institution, never sat in that classroom, never learned the truths that now torment my every waking hour. A diary entry by Elizabeth Prescott, 1889. The mathematics make sense but should not. The proofs are sound, but lead to conclusions that violate every principle of natural law I was raised to believe. Professor Whitmore said we should embrace these contradictions, that they reveal the true nature of reality. But I cannot embrace them. They terrify me. A suicide note by Anna Lawrence, 1894. I see too clearly now. I understand what he taught us. I understand the nature of space and time and consciousness. And I cannot bear to exist with this knowledge. The world is not what we believe it to be. We are not what we believe ourselves to be. I must escape. What had Professor Whitmore taught these women? What knowledge had he imparted that led to such despair, such madness, such universal destruction? I found Whitmore's curriculum for the 1887 natural philosophy class, preserved in the seminary archives. It started conventionally enough. Newton's laws, basic mechanics, optics, electricity, and magnetism. But the later lectures had unusual titles: Non-Euclidean Geometries and the Structure of Space, The Mechanical Basis of Consciousness, Time as a Dimension of Space, the multiplicity of realities, perception and the limits of physical law. These topics were extraordinarily advanced for 1887, even for university-level physics. They represented cutting-edge theoretical work that wouldn't become mainstream for another 20 or 30 years. And Whitmore was teaching them to young women at a small Vermont seminary. I found a notebook that had belonged to one of the students, Catherine Miller. Her class notes from spring 1887 were initially neat and organized, showing careful attention to Professor Whitmore's lectures. But as the semester progressed, the notes became more frantic, more troubled. Professor W. demonstrated that parallel lines can meet if space is curved in the proper manner. He showed us the mathematics. The equations are undeniable. But if this is true, then everything we believe about geometry, about the very structure of the world, is wrong. Professor W. explained that time is not absolute, that it can pass at different rates depending on conditions we cannot directly perceive. He showed us how consciousness might be understood as a mechanical process, no different from any other physical phenomenon. This troubles me deeply. If consciousness is merely mechanical, what becomes of the soul? Prof. Yu has suggested that there may be dimensions beyond the three spatial dimensions we perceive. He has shown us mathematical proofs that such dimensions must exist. He says we cannot perceive them because our minds are limited, but that with proper training, it may be possible to expand our perception. Some of my classmates are excited by this. I am frightened. The final entry, dated May 1887. Professor W. conducted a demonstration today that I cannot adequately describe. He arranged mirrors and lights in a particular configuration and asked us to observe the resulting patterns. What we saw, I cannot put it into words. Spaces within spaces, angles that should not exist. The room seemed to fold in upon itself, and for a moment I felt I could see beyond the surface of reality into some deeper, more terrible truth. Several girls fainted. Margaret began screaming and could not be calmed for an hour. Professor W. seemed pleased with the result. He said we had glimpsed the scaffolding beneath the world. He said this was the beginning of our true education. I wish I had never come to this school. I wish I had never met Professor Whitmore. I wish I could unsee what I have seen. Catherine Miller died in 1893 at age 27. Her death certificate listed the cause as brain fever, but a letter from her physician to her family provided more detail. Miss Miller's final days were marked by profound distress. She claimed to see geometries that should not exist, to perceive dimensions that human senses cannot normally detect. She drew strange diagrams that made no physical sense, yet followed their own inexplicable logic. She said repeatedly that Professor Whitmore had broken something in her mind, that he had forced her consciousness to expand beyond its natural limits, and that she could not contract it back to its original state. I believe her mind simply could not bear the strain of whatever knowledge she had acquired. The human brain is not designed to comprehend certain truths. When forced to do so, it breaks. I found Professor Whitmore's fate in the seminary records. He had been dismissed in 1889, 2 years after that fateful class. The official reason was listed as conduct unbecoming, but I found a letter from the seminary's president to the board of trustees that explained more. Professor Whitmore's methods have proven dangerous to the mental health of his students. Several alumni have reported persistent distress related to material learned in his classes. 2 former students have been institutionalized. Their families blame the instruction they received at our institution. Moreover, Professor Whitmore has become increasingly erratic in his own behavior. He speaks of revealing the true structure of reality and expanding human consciousness beyond its natural bounds. He claims to have developed techniques that allow him to perceive dimensions beyond normal human experience. I fear he has lost his reason. For the safety of our current students and the reputation of our institution, I recommend his immediate dismissal. Professor Thaddeus Whitmore had been dismissed in June 1889. I found a few scattered records of his subsequent life. He had moved to Boston and attempted to continue his research independently. He had published several papers in obscure journals, papers with titles like The Perception of Higher Dimensional Space and Techniques for Expanding Conscious Awareness Beyond Normal Limits. These papers were largely ignored by the scientific community. The few who commented on them dismissed Whitmore as a crank or a madman. But I found one review, published in an obscure journal in 1891, that was less dismissive. Professor Whitmore's work, while unconventional, touches upon matters that mainstream science is not yet ready to confront. His mathematical proofs are sound, his experimental designs are rigorous, but his conclusions are so disturbing, so far beyond the bounds of accepted physical law, that most scientists will refuse to engage with them. This reviewer has attempted to replicate some of Whitmore's experiments. I can confirm that his results are genuine. The patterns he describes can indeed be generated through the proper arrangement of mirrors and lights. And these patterns do indeed produce profound psychological effects on observers. But I must strongly caution against any further experimentation along these lines. Whatever Whitmore has discovered, it should remain undiscovered. There are truths the human mind is not equipped to comprehend. Whitmore's work forces us to confront such truths. The result is not enlightenment but madness. I will conduct no further experiments. I recommend others follow my example. Professor Whitmore himself died in 1892, at age 63. His death certificate listed the cause as cerebral hemorrhage, but I found a letter from his landlady that provided disturbing context. The professor became increasingly strange in his final months. He covered the walls of his room with mirrors arranged in peculiar configurations. He would sit among them for hours, staring at the reflections. He said he could see the spaces between spaces, and that he was learning to navigate them. In his final week, he barely ate or slept. He seemed to be in a state of constant ecstasy or terror. I could not determine which. He muttered constantly about breaking through and seeing the truth. On the day of his death, I heard him cry out. When I entered his room, I found him collapsed on the floor, blood streaming from his nose and ears. His eyes were open, staring at something I could not see. His face bore an expression of absolute horror. The mirrors around him, I swear they reflected angles and spaces that should not have been there. I had them removed immediately. They troubled me greatly. So Professor Whitmore was dead, and all 38 of his students from that 1887 natural philosophy class were dead. Every single one of them, killed by knowledge that human minds were not meant to possess. But what exactly had he shown them? What was the nature of the truth that had destroyed them all? I found one more document that provided a hint. It was a letter written by one of the students, Eleanor Bradshaw, to her younger sister in 1890. Eleanor would die 3 years later, at age 29, in an asylum. But in this letter, written before her complete mental collapse, she tried to explain. "Dearest Clara, you ask me what I learned in Professor Whitmore's class that has affected me so profoundly. I will try to explain, though I doubt you will understand. I am not certain I understand it myself. Professor Whitmore taught us that the world we perceive is not the world as it truly is. The three-dimensional space we inhabit, the linear time we experience, the solid matter we interact with, all of these are simplifications, shadows cast by a more complex reality that our senses cannot directly perceive. He showed us mathematical proofs demonstrating that space must have more than 3 dimensions. He explained that these additional dimensions exist all around us, but that our consciousness is too limited to perceive them. He said that with proper training and the right experimental techniques, it might be possible to expand our perception to include these hidden dimensions. And then he showed us. Through an arrangement of mirrors and lights, through certain patterns and geometries, he created a situation in which we could momentarily perceive beyond the normal 3 dimensions. We saw spaces folded in upon themselves. We saw distances that were simultaneously near and far. We saw angles that should not exist. And Clara, it was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. Since that day, I have not been able to fully return to my previous way of seeing. Sometimes, in certain lights, or when I am very tired, I catch glimpses of those other dimensions. I see the world as it truly is, layered, complex, fundamentally different from what we believe. But the human mind is not designed for this. We evolved to perceive 3 dimensions because those are the dimensions we need to survive. Perceiving more than that is like trying to pour an ocean into a teacup. The mind simply cannot hold it. Professor Whitmore believed he was expanding our consciousness, elevating us to a higher plane of understanding. But what he actually did was break us. He forced us to see truths we were never meant to see, to comprehend geometries our brains were never designed to process. And now we are paying the price. Those of us who saw what he showed us are being slowly driven mad by the knowledge we cannot forget and cannot fully comprehend. We exist between 2 states of understanding, no longer content with the simple 3-dimensional world, but unable to fully grasp the higher dimensional reality we briefly glimpsed. It is torture, Clara. It is a curse masquerading as enlightenment. Warn others. If anyone speaks of Professor Whitmore, if anyone mentions his work, tell them to stay away. Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess. Some truths are better left undiscovered. Your loving sister, Eleanor. I sat in the archives room, surrounded by death certificates and asylum records and desperate letters, and I thought about those 38 young women. They had gone to Bennington Female Seminary, seeking education, seeking to expand their minds and improve their prospects. They had signed up for Professor Whitmore's natural philosophy class, expecting to learn about Newton's laws and the principles of optics. Instead, they had been shown something that destroyed them. They had glimpsed higher dimensions, perceived geometries beyond human comprehension, and the knowledge had broken their minds one by one. Every single student from that 1887 class was dead by 1895. And Professor Whitmore himself had died staring in horror at something visible only to him. Blood streaming from his nose and ears, his mind finally shattered by the truths he had forced it to contain. I compiled my findings into a comprehensive report and presented them to the Vermont Historical Society's director. She read through the materials, her expression growing increasingly disturbed. "This is extraordinary," she said finally. "You're suggesting that a physics professor in 1887 discovered something about the nature of reality that literally drove his students insane." "I'm suggesting that the evidence indicates that," I said carefully. "Whether we believe it or not, the facts are clear. Every student in that class died young, most of them from conditions affecting the mind. Their own writings suggest they were traumatized by something they learned or saw in Whitmore's class. And Whitmore himself appears to have gone mad. But what could he have actually shown them? What truth could be so terrible that it destroys everyone who learns it? I don't know. The mathematics of higher dimensions, some genuinely new understanding of the structure of space and time. Or perhaps, I hesitated, perhaps nothing at all. Perhaps it was mass hysteria, a collective delusion triggered by a charismatic teacher and suggestible students. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The mathematical notes I'd read were too sophisticated, too far ahead of their time. Professor Whitmore had understood aspects of physics that wouldn't be formally developed for decades. He had taught his students genuine truths about the nature of reality. And those truths had killed them all. The photograph of Professor Whitmore's 1887 natural philosophy class now hangs in the Vermont Historical Society's exhibit on women's education. The placard beside it reads, "Students and Faculty of Bennington Female Seminary, 1887. This photograph shows Professor Thaddeus Whitmore with his natural philosophy class. Professor Whitmore was known for his advanced and unconventional teaching methods. He was dismissed from the seminary in 1889. Tragically, all of the students shown in this photograph died young, most before reaching age 35. The reasons for their premature deaths remain a subject of historical investigation. The placard doesn't mention what I know. It doesn't say that Professor Whitmore showed these 38 young women something that destroyed them. It doesn't explain that he forced their minds to perceive dimensions beyond human comprehension, to see geometries that should not exist, to glimpse truths that human consciousness is not designed to contain. It doesn't need to. The photograph speaks for itself if you know how to read it. Look at the faces of those young women. See the tension in their postures, the uncertainty in their expressions. This photograph was taken in the spring of 1887, near the end of the semester, when Professor Whitmore conducted his most disturbing demonstrations. By the time this photograph was taken, they had already seen what he had to show them. They had already been broken, and in the center of the group, Professor Thaddeus Whitmore sits with that intense expression, that suggestion of fierce intelligence. He believed he was enlightening these women, expanding their minds, elevating them to higher levels of understanding. Instead, he condemned them to death, some quick, some agonizingly slow, but all inevitable. Because there are truths the human mind is not meant to know. There are geometries we are not designed to perceive. There are dimensions beyond the three we inhabit, and perceiving them, truly perceiving them, not just understanding them mathematically, shatters something fundamental in human consciousness. Professor Whitmore discovered this, and he shared his discovery with 38 young women in the spring of 1887. By 1895, all 39 of them were dead. The photograph remains, and on the back, in faded ink, that terrible inscription, "May God have mercy on their souls." Because there was no mercy on earth for the students of Professor Whitmore's 1887 natural philosophy class. There was only madness, despair, and death, the inevitable consequences of perceiving what should remain hidden, of knowing what humans were never meant to know. I keep a copy of the photograph on my desk. Sometimes, late at night, I study the faces of those doomed young women and wonder what they saw in Professor Whitmore's classroom. What patterns of light and mirror and geometry did he show them? What truth did they glimpse that destroyed them all? And sometimes, when the light falls just right across the photograph, I think I can see something in the background, angles that don't quite make sense, spaces that fold in ways three-dimensional space should not fold. But perhaps that's just my imagination. Perhaps I've researched this case too deeply, read too many desperate letters from women who saw too much and could not forget. Or perhaps Professor Whitmore's work left traces that persist even in photographs. Perhaps the truth he revealed is so fundamental, so powerful, that it bleeds through into any image connected to it. I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to know, because every single person who learned what Professor Whitmore had to teach is dead, and they died badly, insane, desperate, broken by knowledge they could neither forget nor fully comprehend. The photograph of the 1887 natural philosophy class remains. 38 young women and one professor, all doomed by a spring semester at Bennington Female Seminary, all killed by truth, all destroyed by enlightenment. May God have mercy on their souls indeed.